There are towns in the Pacific Northwest where the fog rolls in so thick in the morning that you cannot see your hand in front of your face. Towns where the Douglas firs press in so close to the roads that driving through them feels less like moving forward and more like being swallowed whole. Towns where everyone knows your name, where your children go to school with the children of people your grandparents once knew, where the idea that something terrible could happen, not somewhere else, not on the evening news, but here, on this road, in this house, to this family, feels so impossible that the mind simply refuses it. This is a story set in one of those towns. The year was 1997. The place was King County, Washington State, a stretch of rural and suburban landscape east of Seattle, where the Cascade foothills begin their slow rise from the valley floor. It was late October, the kind of autumn that the Pacific Northwest does with devastating beauty, amber and copper leaves catching in the wind, the smell of wood smoke drifting across quiet cul-de-sacs, the sky that particular shade of pewter gray that feels less like clouds and more like the heavens pulling a curtain closed. School buses were running. Halloween decorations were taped to windows. Pumpkins sat on front porches, their carved faces not yet lit. And somewhere inside a modest ranch-style house at the end of a long gravel driveway, a young woman named Christine Elaine Farrow, 31 years old, brown-haired, the mother of two small children, was living what appeared from every observable angle to be a quiet, ordinary life. She was last seen on October 22, 1997. What happened between that morning and the weeks and months and years that followed would become one of King County's most haunting unresolved cases. A case that sat in a manila folder in a detective's filing cabinet for the better part of 2 decades, collecting dust and unanswered questions, while the man investigators had always looked at most closely continued living his life less than 40 miles away. The question that hung over everything, the one that lingered in the hallways of the county sheriff's department long after the case went cold, was not simply what happened to Christine Farrow. The question, whispered, then spoken aloud, then eventually shouted in a courtroom, was how someone could look directly into the eyes of law enforcement, of neighbors, of his own children, for 27 years and say nothing. To understand what happened to Christine Farrow, you have to understand where she lived. Not just geographically, though geography matters here, matters enormously, but in terms of the social fabric of the place, the texture of daily life, the particular kind of insularity that comes with small communities nested in vast wilderness. The area east of Seattle where Christine and her family had settled was the kind of place people moved when they wanted land and quiet, and the feeling of space that the city couldn't provide. The roads there in 1997 were partly paved and partly gravel, depending on how far back from the main highway you went. The houses were set apart, separated by stands of fir and hemlock and cedar, by creek beds that ran high in the spring and low in August, by the kind of natural barriers that made neighbors feel simultaneously close and distant. You might know the family 3 lots over well enough to wave, well enough to recognize their truck, and still have no real idea what happened inside their home on any given evening. Christine Elaine Farrow had grown up in Snohomish County, the daughter of a mechanic named Gerald Holloway and a school secretary named Patricia. She had been, by all accounts, a warm and practical woman, the kind who kept her children's immunization records in a color-coded binder, who made soup from scratch when someone on the street was sick, who could be counted on. She had met her husband, Daniel Farrow, in 1989 at a community event in Redmond. They married in 1991. Their daughter, Madison, was born in 1992. Their son, Tyler, arrived in 1994. By 1997, Christine was 31 years old and working part-time as a bookkeeper for a small landscaping company out of Issaquah. Daniel, 34, worked irregular hours as a subcontractor in residential construction, framing mostly, with occasional drywall work when framing jobs ran dry. The family was not wealthy, but they were not struggling in any visible way. They had a mortgage. They had a second-hand Dodge Caravan and a Ford pickup. They had a propane grill on the back deck and a trampoline in the side yard that Madison and Tyler used every afternoon that it wasn't raining, which in western Washington in October was not often. The morning of October 22, 1997, began without distinction. Clears throat. It is important to hold that in mind, the ordinary, unremarkable nature of that morning, because people look for ruptures in retrospect. They search for signs, for omens, for the moment when the day tilted on its axis. But those who knew Christine and who spoke later to investigators described a woman going through the motions of a Wednesday morning with no visible distress. She packed lunches. She drove Madison, 5 years old, to her kindergarten class at Tahoma Elementary. She returned home with Tyler, 3, still in his pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. A neighbor named Rosemary Alt, who lived on the same gravel road, perhaps a quarter-mile east, told investigators that she had seen Christine's van pull back into the driveway at approximately 8:15 in the morning. She remembered because she had been walking her dog, a beagle named Chester, and Christine had waved from the driver's window. A brief wave. Nothing unusual. Rosemary would later describe it to a detective as just the kind of wave you give someone when you're tired, but you see them every day. That was the last confirmed sighting of Christine Farrow by anyone other than members of her own household. The school day at Tahoma Elementary ended at 3:10 in the afternoon. Madison was not picked up. This was the first visible crack. When no one came for her by 3:30, a teacher's aide named Donna Pierce brought Madison to the office. School staff attempted to reach Christine at home. No answer. They tried the number on file for Daniel Farrow. He did not answer either. At 4:15, with Madison growing distressed in the school office, Donna Pierce called the non-emergency line for King County Sheriff's Department. It took another hour and 15 minutes for a deputy to arrive at the Farrow residence on Old Mill Road. What the deputy found and what he documented in his initial report was this: the front door unlocked, Tyler's wooden toy truck on its side in the living room, a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter cold, a load of laundry in the washing machine mid-cycle and then left so that the clothes had begun to smell of mildew, Christine's purse on the kitchen table, her wallet inside it, her car keys on the hook by the door. The swing in the side yard hung completely still. Daniel Farrow arrived home at approximately 6:45 that evening. He told the deputy that he had been at a job site in Auburn since early morning. He expressed concern. He appeared, and this word would come up again and again in subsequent notes, composed. Not numb, not shell-shocked, composed. Christine was gone. Tyler, 3 years old, was sitting in his pajamas on the living room floor when deputies arrived. He had been alone in the house for, by best estimates, somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. He was still holding a picture book about dinosaurs. He had not eaten since breakfast. By the morning of October 23rd, the King County Sheriff's Department had officially opened a missing persons investigation into Christine Elaine Farrow. The initial search was methodical in the way that such operations were in the late 1990s, before digital mapping, before GPS tracking, before the forensic technologies that would later become routine. Deputies walked the property on Old Mill Road in grid formations. A K-9 unit was brought in. Volunteers from the surrounding community, perhaps 40 people on that first day, expanding to nearly 80 by the weekend, combed the tree lines, the creek beds, the abandoned logging roads that wound back into the hills east of the residence. They found nothing. No physical evidence of a struggle inside the home, no signs of forced entry, no blood. The coffee cup on the counter carried Christine's fingerprints, and only Christine's fingerprints. The laundry in the machine was hers. Everything that was hers was still there in the house, precisely as you would expect to find it if she had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. Except she hadn't returned. Clear's throat. The community response in those first days was genuine and urgent. Flyers were printed. Christine's photograph, a snapshot from Tyler's second birthday, her laughing, her head tilted back, her hair loose around her shoulders, appeared in the windows of grocery stores and gas stations from Maple Valley to North Bend. Local radio stations ran announcements. The family's pastor organized a prayer vigil at the church on Pioneer Avenue that drew over 200 people on a rainy Thursday night. Daniel Farrow stood at the front of that vigil. He spoke briefly. He thanked people for coming. He asked for anyone with information to please come forward. Those who were present that night described him differently depending on who you asked. Some said he seemed devastated. Others said something different. A woman named Linda Cavanaugh, who had known Christine since their children were in the same playgroup, told a detective several weeks later, "He didn't cry, not once. I kept watching his face. He held Madison the whole time, but his eyes were, I don't know how to describe it, dry, not blank exactly, just dry." Deputies noted this observation in their files. It was not, at that stage, evidence. It was an impression. But in investigations like this, impressions accumulate. The detective assigned to lead the investigation was a man named Sergeant Victor Pryor, a 17-year veteran of King County who had worked missing persons before, and who had, according to colleagues, a well-developed instinct for the spaces between what people said and what people meant. Pryor began conducting formal interviews within the first 72 hours. What he found in those interviews was not a clear picture. It was, instead, a picture with small, nagging distortions. Daniel Farrow told investigators that he had left the house at approximately 6:30 in the morning to drive to the job site in Auburn. The distance from Old Mill Road to the Auburn site was approximately 34 miles. Depending on traffic on Highway 18, this could take anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour and 15. Daniel's employer confirmed that he had been present at the site, but could not specify an exact arrival time. The project supervisor told Sergeant Pryor that he noticed Daniel sometime in the morning, probably mid-morning, but admitted he had not been watching the clock. This was the first timeline discrepancy. If Daniel had left at 6:30, as he stated, and the drive took a maximum of 75 minutes under the worst conditions, he should have arrived no later than 7:45. Mid-morning to most people suggests somewhere between 9:00 and 11:00. That gap, 90 minutes at minimum, possibly 3 hours, was noted by Sergeant Pryor in his case log with a single handwritten notation, "Time unaccounted for. Verify." The verification never came. No one at the job site could place Daniel's arrival with any precision. A time card system was in use, but the cards were logged at sign-in, and Daniel's card showed him signing in at 7:52. Investigators would later question whether that sign-in time was accurate, or whether someone, Daniel himself, or a coworker covering for him, had marked it retrospectively. The second distortion came from an unexpected source. Rosemary Alt, the neighbor who had seen Christine wave from the van at 8:15 in the morning, mentioned to investigators, almost as an afterthought, that she had also noticed Daniel's truck in the driveway when she walked her dog. She had assumed, she said, that he was still getting ready to leave for work. She remembered thinking it was later than she expected, given that he usually left early. Daniel's own account placed him already on the road by 8:15. He said he had left at 6:30. Rosemary Alt's dog walk, she told investigators, was always between 8:00 and 8:30. She was certain. Daniel's truck had been in that driveway at 8:15. Clears throat. Sergeant Pryor brought Daniel in for a second formal interview on November 3, 1997. The conversation lasted 4 hours. According to Pryor's notes, Daniel was cooperative in tone but consistently vague on specifics. When pressed about the timeline, he suggested that perhaps he had gone back inside after initially going to his truck, perhaps to retrieve a tool or to use the bathroom. He couldn't be certain. It had been a normal morning. His demeanor throughout that interview was noted as calm and deliberate. He answered questions slowly, carefully, as if measuring each sentence before releasing it. He never once said her name in that room, Pryor wrote in his case log. In 4 hours of talking about his missing wife, he never once said Christine. The investigation continued into November and December of 1997. The search area was expanded twice. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched a retention pond less than 2 miles from the Farrow property. A tip line generated over 60 calls, most of them unhelpful. No trace of Christine was found. By January of 1998, the active search had been officially suspended. The case was not closed. It was never formally closed, but it entered that gray territory that law enforcement speaks of quietly, which is to say, it stopped moving forward and started waiting. Waiting for a witness to come forward. Waiting for remains to be found. Waiting for the kind of break that only time or conscience or accident can provide. The case went cold. Sergeant Pryor retired in 2004. He left a note in the physical case file, handwritten, which would not be read by the detective who eventually reopened the investigation until 2019. The note read, "Look at the husband. Look at him again. Look at the odometer." Life in its relentless indifference continued. By the spring of 1998, Daniel Farrow had moved. Not far, he relocated to a rental property in Covington, roughly 15 miles southwest of the old Mill Road house, but far enough that the neighbors who had watched him and speculated and whispered were no longer watching. Madison started first grade in a new school district. Tyler turned 4 in June. There was a birthday cake with blue frosting and candles that he could not yet blow out by himself. Christine's parents, Gerald and Patricia Holloway, maintained contact with the children in those early years. They had retained a family attorney. They asked questions. They pushed, as gently and then as firmly as they could, for the investigation to remain active. Gerald Holloway gave an interview to a regional newspaper in 1999 in which he said, carefully, that the family had concerns that had not been adequately addressed. He did not name Daniel. He did not have to. Daniel Farrow, for his part, filed a petition to have Christine legally declared deceased in 2001. Under Washington state law, a missing person can be declared legally dead after 5 years under certain circumstances. The petition was processed. The declaration was issued. Daniel was named the primary beneficiary of a modest life insurance policy, approximately $90,000, that Christine had maintained through her employer. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that particular, nauseating uncertainty, that suspended horror of not knowing whether your suspicion makes you perceptive or simply cruel, you will understand something of what Christine's family lived with in those years. Every holiday, every school play that Madison and Tyler appeared in, every graduation photograph that Daniel sent them eventually, when the children were older and the contact had become sporadic and uncomfortable. all of it overlaid with a question that had no answer, all of it tinged with the specific grief that comes not from confirmed loss but from permanent uncertainty. Patricia Holloway began keeping a journal in 1999. She filled 17 of them over the following 2 decades. In excerpts shared later with investigators, she described nightmares that came and went in cycles, vivid, specific dreams in which Christine was trying to speak but couldn't make a sound. She wrote about watching Tyler in home videos from his early childhood and noticing the way he sometimes looked toward the front door, even in the middle of play, as if expecting someone to come through it. Clears throat. Madison, as she grew older, became the one who asked the questions directly. She was 7 when her mother vanished, old enough to retain genuine memory, young enough that those memories had the hazy, fragmented quality of something seen through water. By the time she was a teenager, she was researching her mother's case online, finding the limited newspaper coverage, the archived missing persons listings, the photograph of Christine laughing at Tyler's birthday party. She told her maternal grandmother years later that she had always felt, in a way she could not fully articulate, that the answer was nearby, that the distance between the truth and her was not measured in miles. Daniel Farrow remarried in 2003. His second wife, a woman named Susan, had 2 children from a previous relationship. The household became, by external appearances, a functional blended family. The construction work continued. There were no further brushes with law enforcement, no incidents, no investigations, no flags. For those who have ever watched someone rebuild a life and wondered whether the act of rebuilding was genuine or simply practiced, whether the new normalcy was recovery or performance, the answer, in most cases, is impossible to know from the outside. And that impossibility is precisely what protects people who have things to hide. The marriage to Susan deteriorated by 2011. The couple separated without particular drama. Daniel moved again, this time to a smaller house in the Auburn area. And it is worth noting, for reasons that will become apparent, that this placed him almost precisely at the western end of Highway 18, at the nearest edge of the route he had claimed to travel on the morning of October 22, 1997. By 2015, Daniel Farrow was living alone. He was 52 years old. He worked occasional construction jobs and supplemented with odd contracting work. He was, to the few neighbors who had any impression of him at all, a quiet man who kept his property tidy and his interactions minimal. Tyler Farrow, by this point 21 years old, had enrolled in a community college in Renton. He was studying environmental science. He had his mother's coloring, the brown hair, the particular set of the jaw, and he had her practicality, the color-coded organization, the deliberate care with details. He had also, quietly, without telling his father, been writing letters to the King County Sheriff's Department's cold case unit since he turned 18. The letters were polite. They were detailed. They referenced specific points in the original investigation that Tyler had assembled from documents obtained through public records requests. They asked, again and again, whether advances in forensic technology might allow for a renewed examination of the physical evidence from the original scene. The cold case unit sent form responses. It noted the letters in the file. It did not reopen the investigation. Not yet. The breaking point came not from a letter, and not from new technology, and not from any external development that could have been predicted or manufactured. It came from a conversation. In 2019, Madison Farrow, now 27 years old, living in Tacoma, working as a social worker, had dinner with her brother at a restaurant in Federal Way. They had not seen each other in several months. The dinner was quiet and then gradually not quiet. At some point in the evening, Tyler told Madison something that he had carried for over 20 years, something he had never said aloud, a memory so fragmentary and disturbing that he had spent his entire adult life trying to decide whether it was real. He had been 3 years old on the morning of October 22nd, 1997. He told Madison that he remembered his father coming back into the house. What Tyler Farrow told his sister at that dinner in Federal Way, and later, in documented form, to a King County cold case detective named Sharon Vance, was this. He had a memory, thin and uncertain as early childhood memories always are, of standing in the doorway of the kitchen and watching his father come in through the back door of the house. Not the front door, the back. The sliding glass door that opened onto the deck where the propane grill sat. His father's clothes, Tyler said, had not been his work clothes. Or rather, they had been, but something was different. He couldn't define it further. He was 3 years old. The image had never fully resolved. But it had never fully gone away, either. He also told Detective Vance something more concrete, that in the weeks after his mother's disappearance, he had witnessed his father cleaning the interior of the Ford pickup truck with a thoroughness and intensity that had registered even to a 3-year-old as unusual. Not a normal cleaning, something systematic, something that went on for a long time. Clears throat. Detective Sharon Vance had joined the King County Cold Case Unit in 2016. She was 43 years old, a meticulous investigator who had been drawn to unresolved cases, specifically because of their complexity, and because of what she described, in a departmental interview, as the patience they require that other cases don't. She had read the Farrow file twice before Tyler's formal statement, and had noted the same things Sergeant Pryor had noted 2 decades earlier. The timeline gap, the truck in the driveway, the absent name in the interview transcript. When Tyler's statement came in through the formal channel in late 2019, Detective Vance did not treat it as definitive. She treated it as a door. A 3-year-old's memory, 22 years later, does not constitute evidence, she wrote in her case reopening notes, but it constitutes a direction. She began with what she could verify: the life insurance claim from 2001, the financial records from the period of Christine's disappearance, the job site in Auburn. She tracked down the former project supervisor, now retired and living in Oregon, a man named Gary Teague. Teague, 71 years old when Vance reached him by phone in January 2020, had a clearer memory than investigators might have expected. "I always thought about that case," Teague told Vance, "because when I was interviewed back then, I said mid-morning, and I've always felt like maybe I didn't think hard enough about it." He told Vance that his genuine recollection, if he was honest, was that Daniel had arrived closer to 10 in the morning, possibly 10:30. He had not said this with confidence in 1997 because he had not been certain, and being uncertain and potentially pointing a finger at a man whose wife was missing had felt reckless. He was certain enough now. If Daniel Farrow had arrived at the Auburn job site at 10 or 10:30 on the morning of October 22nd, and if Rosemary Alt's memory of the truck in the driveway at 8:15 was accurate, then there was a gap of approximately 2 hours in which Daniel's location was entirely unaccounted for. A 2-hour window, a 34-mile distance between the house and the job site that could be driven in 40 minutes under normal conditions. That left 90 minutes with nowhere to go. Clears throat. Detective Vance requested a review of all physical evidence still held in storage from the original 1997 investigation. Washington State maintains physical evidence in active or unresolved cases indefinitely, and the Farrow case, though cold, had never been formally closed. What remained in evidence storage was limited. Swabs from the kitchen counter, carpet samples from 2 rooms, a pair of work gloves recovered from the Ford pickup during the initial search, and several items of Christine's clothing found in the laundry room. The gloves were processed using modern luminol and DNA analysis techniques unavailable in 1997. The results came back in August 2020. The gloves contained trace biological material. The material was consistent with Christine Farrow's DNA profile, which had been established through reference samples provided by her parents during the original investigation and preserved in the state's forensic database. It was not conclusive. Trace material on work gloves worn by a man whose wife lived in the same house could have an innocent explanation. Vance knew this. She documented it with appropriate scientific caution, but she also noted that the gloves had been described in the original 1997 evidence log as found behind the driver's seat, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. Not in a tool bag, not in the bed of the truck, wrapped and tucked. The architecture of the case was becoming visible. In October 2020, exactly 23 years after Christine Farrow was last seen alive, Detective Vance coordinated with the King County Prosecutor's Office to convene a formal case review. Present at that review were Vance, 2 assistant prosecutors, a forensic consultant, and brought in from Florida, where she had moved after her retirement, a former investigator named Carol Messner, who had briefly worked the original Farrow case alongside Sergeant Pryor. Messner brought something to that meeting that she had held for 23 years. She brought her own handwritten notes from the original interviews, not the official transcripts, which were in the file, but her personal notebook, the one she kept for her own thinking. In those notes, recorded in October 1997, was a passage about a conversation she had with Daniel Farrow on the 3rd day of the investigation. She had asked him informally whether there was anywhere Christine might have gone, a friend, a family member, anywhere she might have felt the need to escape to. Daniel had said no. He had said they were happy. He had said there was no reason for her to leave. And then Messner's notebook recorded. He had said something that she had noted at the time and then not known what to do with. Whatever happened, she didn't take anything with her. Messner had written 3 words next to that quote, circled twice. How does he know? She had been missing less than 24 hours. Her purse and keys were in the house, yes. But how does a man whose wife has inexplicably vanished express certainty, this early, that whatever happened is a fixed and finished event? How does a man processing the shock and uncertainty of a missing wife arrive, within 72 hours at the past tense? Whatever happened. Not whatever is happening, not wherever she is. Whatever happened. The case review in October 2020 concluded with a unanimous recommendation to proceed toward arrest, pending final review by the prosecutor's office. The arrest warrant for Daniel Raymond Farrow was signed on March 4, 2021. He was charged with 1 count of homicide in the 1st degree in connection with the disappearance and believed passing of Christine Elaine Farrow on or about October 22, 1997. Clears throat. The arrest itself took place on the morning of March 9, 2021, at Daniel Farrow's residence in Auburn, that modest house at the western edge of Highway 18, less than 40 miles from where Christine had last been seen 23.5 years earlier. Detective Vance was present. 2 additional deputies executed the warrant. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast, the kind of flat Pacific Northwest sky that makes light feel theoretical rather than actual. Daniel Farrow came to the door in a work jacket and jeans. He was 58 years old. He had gray at his temples and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. When Detective Vance identified herself and stated the purpose of the visit, he did not speak immediately. He looked at her. He looked at the two deputies. He looked briefly at the street behind them, perhaps checking for neighbors, perhaps for something else entirely. Then he said, "I figured this would happen eventually." He did not elaborate. He was read his rights. He did not resist. He was placed in a patrol vehicle and transported to the King County Correctional Facility, where he was booked on the morning of March 9th, 2021 at 9:47 a.m. The news moved through the community with the particular velocity that old, unresolved cases generate when they finally break, faster than breaking news, more intimate, more disorienting. Because the community here was not just the neighborhood on Old Mill Road, the families who had put up flyers in 1997. The community was everyone who had known Christine, everyone who had attended that prayer vigil, everyone who had watched Daniel raise those two children and quietly wondered, and then, over time, stopped wondering because the wondering produced nothing but discomfort. "I felt sick," Linda Kavanaugh, the woman who had watched Daniel's dry eyes at the prayer vigil in 1997, told a local news outlet the day after the arrest. "I felt sick, and I felt like I had known and hadn't done enough, and I felt relieved, and I felt terrible about feeling relieved. All of those things at the same time." Others in the community expressed disbelief. Daniel Farrow had neighbors in Auburn who had known him for years, who described him as quiet, helpful, unremarkable. A man named Paul Eckert, who had worked alongside Daniel on a residential framing job in 2018, told a reporter, "I don't know what to say. He wasn't a friendly man, exactly, but he wasn't anything that made you think this. He wasn't anything that made you think this at all." That dissonance between the observable surface of a person and what lies beneath is not unique to this case. It is, in fact, among the most consistent features of cases like this one. The observable surface is, in most instances, the point. The ordinary life is the camouflage. Madison Farrow learned about the arrest from a phone call from Detective Vance on the morning of March 9th. She had been living with the knowledge that the case had been reopened since late 2019. She had been interviewed twice. She had provided the investigators with copies of her grandmother's journals, with the photograph from Tyler's birthday party, with her own patient and accumulated documentation of a life lived in the shadow of an unanswered question. When Detective Vance called to tell her that Daniel Farrow was in custody, Madison Farrow was at her desk at the social services office where she worked. She stepped outside into the parking lot. A coworker who watched through the window described her as standing very still for a long time, not crying, not moving, simply standing in the overcast morning air with her phone at her side. Tyler was driving when his phone rang. He pulled over. He sat in his car on the shoulder of a road in Renton for 22 minutes before he was able to continue driving. The preliminary hearing was held on March 22, 2021. The courtroom was at capacity. Both Madison and Tyler were present, seated in the gallery on the prosecution's side. Daniel Farrow entered in a gray detention uniform, flanked by his court-appointed defense counsel. He entered a plea of not guilty. He looked, according to multiple accounts from those present, much as he had always looked, composed, deliberate, measuring every movement. The forensic evidence presented at preliminary hearings included the DNA trace from the work gloves, the revised timeline testimony from Gary Teague, the testimony of Rosemary Alt, now 70 years old and still living on the same road, still walking dogs every morning, and the documented statement from Tyler Farrow regarding his recovered childhood memory. Additional evidence included cell tower records from 2021 forensic reconstruction, using records that had, remarkably, been preserved in a partial form by the original telecommunications provider, which placed a device registered to Daniel Farrow in a range consistent with the Old Mill Road property at 8:43 in the morning on October 22, 1997, more than 2 hours after he claimed to have left. The defense challenged the reliability of recovered childhood memories. The defense challenged the chain of custody of the biological material from the gloves. The defense argued that the cell tower records, partially reconstructed from decades-old archives, were insufficiently precise to establish location. These were not frivolous arguments. Cases built on cold forensics and reconstructed timelines are genuinely complex. The science of memory, particularly early childhood memory, is legitimately contested. Vance knew this. The prosecutors knew this. The case they had constructed was circumstantial in places, and they were under no illusion that it was airtight. What it was, however, was exhaustive. It was 23 years of accumulated detail, of small things that didn't fit, of inconsistencies that had never found their innocent explanation. The trial was set for October 2022. The date was deliberate, or felt deliberate, 25 years from the month Christine Farrow had vanished. The proceedings lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. On October 28, 2022, a Friday afternoon with rain coming in off the Sound, and the maples along the courthouse steps blazing their last red before the season ended, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of homicide in the first degree. Daniel Raymond Farrow showed no visible reaction. He was standing when the verdict was read. He did not move. He did not look at his children. He did not look anywhere in the gallery at all. He looked at a point somewhere above the judge's head, slightly to the left, in that particular way that people look at nothing when they are determined not to look at something. Outside the courthouse, Madison Farrow stood with her brother in the rain. Someone held an umbrella over them. Neither of them appeared to notice the rain. Madison spoke to a small cluster of reporters. She was composed, but not in the way her father had always been composed. Hers was a different quality entirely, less like a surface held in place than like something genuinely settled, genuinely at rest. She said, "My mother's name was Christine Elaine Farrow. She was 31 years old. She was kind and she was practical and she packed our lunches and she loved us. She deserves to be remembered, and she deserves for people to know that what happened to her was not a mystery and was not an accident and was not something nobody could ever figure out. It took a long time, but it happened." She paused. Then she said, "I want to thank Tyler. He held this longer than anyone should ever have to hold anything." Clears throat. Christine's remains have never been recovered. This is the one detail that the verdict does not resolve, that no verdict can resolve. The sentencing, Daniel Farrow received a term of 32 years, making his earliest possible release date his 90th birthday, closes a legal chapter. It does not close the chapter of not knowing where she is. That remains open. That will perhaps always remain open. Gerald Holloway, Christine's father, passed away in 2014. He did not live to hear the verdict. Patricia, 81 years old at the time of sentencing, was present in the courtroom. She had brought one of her 17 journals. She held it in her lap throughout the proceedings but did not open it. After the sentencing, she set it on the bench beside her and left it there. There is something this case asks of us, if we are willing to be asked. It asks us to sit with the discomfort of how ordinary evil can be made to look. How the same hands that pour cold coffee in the morning, that hold a child's birthday cake, that wave to a neighbor from a truck window, How those same hands can do irreparable things and then be folded calmly on a table in an interview room while a detective asks questions. How a life can be built on top of an act, and how that life can look, from the outside, like any other life. This is uncomfortable knowledge. It does not fit cleanly into any of the categories we have for people. It does not allow for the comfort of pure monstrousness. What it allows for, the only thing it allows for, is the insistence on honesty, on documentation, on the kind of patient, meticulous attention to detail that Sergeant Pryor brought to a handwritten note left in a manila folder, that Detective Vance brought to a piece of evidence stored in a warehouse for 23 years, that Tyler Farrow brought to a fragmented memory. He spent his entire childhood and young adulthood deciding whether to trust. Music returns, the low strings softer now, a single sustained note. The swing hung still. The toy truck lay on its side. The coffee went cold on the counter. And Christine Elaine Farrow, 31 years old, brown-haired, the woman who waved from the van window on a Wednesday morning in October, has never been found. But she has been remembered. And the truth, in the end, was not buried as deeply as someone believed. There are still cases out there, active and cold, recent and decades old, where a family is sitting with that same suspended horror, that same impossibility, that same journal filled with dreams. There are still detectives running out their last working years before retirement, leaving notes in files that they hope someone will read. There are still children, now grown, who carry fragments of something they saw or heard or felt, and are trying to find the courage and the right person and the right moment to say it aloud. Christine Farrow's case is a reminder that cold does not mean closed. That time, given the right application of will and technology and human courage, can move backward as well as forward. That evidence does not expire. That memory, however early, however fragile, however long held in silence, is not nothing. It was never nothing. It was everything.